say, well, all these different species are going to have something in common, and all the species are going to have something in common. So maybe we can say that our traditional idea of genre, right, our traditional idea of genre would correspond to relatively kind of low level of stream, right? So maybe it's like mammals versus vegetables or something like that. But then the idea is that you can add many more levels, and you can adopt which kind of much finer and let's say more comprehensive set of taxonomy or ways of classifying agricultural production. Well, why this is a good idea? I think it may be a good idea because, frankly speaking, right, if I think about contemporary, let's say, graphic design, motion graphics, and our cultural artifacts, which have been designed in software, precisely because of all these processes we went to today, I think what we see is incredible diversity. And okay, maybe if I had like a research institute or supercomputers which would write smart programs, which we don't have yet, maybe I can say, you know what, I'm going to analyze all the different products, all the different cultural products, and in fact, this diversity is an illusion. It can be all reduced to like 5 or 6 genres, but I don't think so. I really don't think so, and I think there are 2 reasons. One reason is that the software itself enables this diversity, and also, as you know, the second reason, which you know very well what it is, because in the 1980s, mass culture, commercial culture changes significantly, and this kind of innovation on the level of form, right, invention of new techniques of communication and representation, which before that really kind of something which was happening in arts, is then adopted as, let's say, the new kind of, as a new ideology of mainstream culture, right? You have a TV, you have all this graphic design, etc., etc., etc. So because the mainstream culture, right, now places the emphasis on innovation and experimentation, right? There are other reasons why we have this kind of diversity. So this is another potential direction where this can go. And just to add something, just to add one more point to it, I think if we also do that, I mean, if we start thinking in this direction, on one hand, we maybe basically can get a handle on making some sense of contemporary kind of design and contemporary cultural production, especially in these new areas where it's really kind of not clear, if there is any kind of clusters or works which can be called genres. But I think this approach will also have big consequences for how we narrate, right, the kind of narratives we create about cultural history. Well, the reason is this: if you go to any European city, and maybe it's also some American cities, particularly European cities, and here's your architectural textbook, right? The architectural textbook tells what the history of modern architecture is that you have eclecticism, you have historicism, and you have Art Nouveau, you have Art Deco, you have functionalism. So you have about between 6 to 7 to 8 categories. Well, what you're going to find out is that 80 or 90% of all buildings in the European cities do not fit into any of these categories. They have some kind of hybrids, right? They have some kind of mutants. They have some kind of, we combine all the different things, but we really don't fit into all these categories. So I have a feeling that precisely because of the limitations of our our system of categories, which we used in, let's say, kind of the way we narrate, research, present culture, right? A very significant percentage of interesting cultural production, produced previously, in fact, completely falls outside of our exhibitions, books, and narratives because they can't be put in the categories. So maybe if we kind of take this idea and apply it on the historical culture, and to say, well, as opposed to saying, okay, here's constructivism, right? So here's category A, and here's functionalism, and here's something else, and it's like these boxes, right? And the building can be either constructivist, or it can be functionalist, or it can be eclectic. Okay? And this is basically how, by and large, our cultural institutions and knowledge production operates. What if we take this idea of kind of these features, right, of these DNAs, which seems to have particular meaning in relation to visual media, and we'll also kind of project this idea back in history. We can say, well, instead of thinking about this, let's say that architectural buildings, right, can use these different techniques of plan or ornamentation or construction, and then what we find is that there's a particular set of, we can say that every work uses some of these techniques, okay, and not ours. Okay? And then let's say if we find that there's a kind of cluster of works, and most of these works have majority of DNAs, right? Have majority of DNAs which are similar, we can say that in fact this corresponds to our traditional idea of style, ism, or genre, but then there's going to be lots of works which do not form these kind of clusters. Okay? Again, I don't think I'm proposing anything new. I think this kind of idea of kind of understanding objects, right, in terms of their kind of features and distribution of features. I think the kind of 20th century linguistics is also uses something similar, but for whatever reasons, I don't think this idea, because maybe it's simply something a little bit more complex, right? It hasn't really been used in our presentation of culture. Right? So that's maybe an example of how we can take this analysis that we did of software media, right, and kind of put it back. Okay. If you guys will see, well, finish it's okay, because there is no reason why we have to finish the next part today. And I kind of went through this very quickly, so if you have some questions or comments.
I have a couple comments.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, you go first, because you are first.
Because you're short.
Is it okay if I eat my apple?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Why do you think so many of the sort of, the buildings or other kind of like quote unquote, there seems to be like some kind of hierarchy involved in like the categorizing of cultural objects that like just, like there's a kind of pedigree that comes with the identification of a style or genre for, say, buildings, and buildings that don't fall within those pedigrees are excluded for.
Yes. That's exactly what my point is, that that maybe if we have a richer system of classification, it will help us to include these buildings, our cultural expressions, into our narratives, right?
Right, but I think some of the reasons for that exclusion aren't about like an inability to like, they're sort of like more like Foucauldian than, like they're about like exclusion.
Exactly.
Yeah, but why this exclusion happens? What are the reasons? Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that the lack of categories is the only reason, but I do think that it's definitely part of the reason. I think it's one of the reasons.
But you don't feel just a pretext or like.
What is the pretext? Sorry.
Well, like this kind of idea that there's not enough oh, I'm sorry, we're out of categories. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's no.
Well,
room at the end.
Well, what I would say is this, right? And this is actually, now like it's going back to what we discussed about yesterday.
Yeah.
What I want to say is this, okay, if I'm using, depending on which media I'm using to exhibit or narrate culture, I can represent some things, not ours, right? So if I'm writing a book, and right, I want to divide this book into chapters, and if these chapters talk about different isms, and it makes makes it the book unreadable, right? Or if I'm making an exhibition in a traditional museum, and I have my rooms, and I can put different works in different rooms. Well, if people perhaps start adopting visualization, right, and computer graphics and visualization, then of course it becomes very, very easy to create more kind of rich representations, right? Because for example, I can put all these cultural objects in a three-dimensional space, right? I don't have limitations of a book, I don't have limitations of a room, and I can see, okay, here are some clusters, and then I can also